kind of add some color to the scene as we try to imagine it. And as I pointed out last week, I'm not a fisherman and I'm not a sailor. Dennis took us out on a boat once when we first moved here, and fortunately it was a lot calmer than it would have been these last few days, because I get seasick very easily. So I can understand the disciples' fear in this story. But then they were experienced fishermen, weren't they? Surely they'd been out in storms before. Yeah, I know that's a picture of a very calm lake, but that's kind of what they wanted it to be like. And what I found out is that they may not have been out in storms like that before, because fishing apparently didn't normally take place in the middle of the lake. And they might never have had to sail across the middle of the lake that way. And it seems that it was Jesus' suggestion that they should do it this time. So might not have been their choice at all. And also, this lake, the Sea of Galilee, as it's often called, but it's actually a lake, not a sea. It's also well known for these sudden storms. I've not been, so I can't describe it exactly, but it's something to do with how the winds blow down from the mountain and the temperature changes and things. You can very suddenly have quite vicious storms blow up there. And also, their boats weren't exactly storm-proof. It wasn't the QE2s they were sailing. They looked more like that. In 1986, they actually found the remains of a first century fishing boat in the lake. It's kind of been covered in mud for 2,000 years, and then they found it, which is quite exciting. Archaeology can be quite exciting. So we know that is not the exact boat that Jesus was in, we presume. There must have been others, but it would have looked about like that. And you can tell, for one thing, it's very shallow. It didn't go very deep in the water, so it would have rocked a lot and could probably quite easily capsize. So, of course, what they do, they cry out to Jesus for help. Just like we heard earlier in Psalm 107. I wonder if they were aware that their situation was very similar to Psalm 107. We read about a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. And then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, which is exactly what the disciples did. And as they did so, they were probably very relieved that Jesus also responded as described in the psalm. He stilled the storm to a whisper, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Whether they had this psalm in mind and sort of half expected Jesus to do that, hard to tell. They may well have. So that was one reason why I chose Psalm 107, because you have the storm and you have the calming of the storm. What you don't have in Psalm 107, though, is criticism for their lack of faith. That is not in the psalm. If anything, the way the psalmist would describe it is that the fact that they cry out to God for help is a sign that they had faith. It wasn't a sign of unbelief, it was a sign of faith. They cried out to God because they believed there would be some help coming from that side. So why does Jesus criticize the disciples? Well, I came across one interesting theory. Some people, I hope it's a minority, some people apparently think that Jesus was annoyed with the disciples, so they should have had enough faith to deal with the storm themselves. I don't know what you think. I think that is asking a little bit too much of these pre-Easter, pre-Pentecost disciples, that they should have been able to calm the storm on their own. And as a matter of fact, even after Easter and Pentecost, nature miracles have generally been very rare throughout church history. Healings, yes. Similar miracles, yes. Nature miracles, they happen, but they are much rarer than healings. So I don't think that's what he was expecting. I think it's more the panic that he's criticizing. That they're they're panicking. They'd seen healings. at this point, we don't know exactly where this comes in the chronology of the Gospels. But they had definitely seen healings already. They had seen some exorcisms. They knew what could happen when Jesus was around. They should have had a bit more faith. Although I don't think that Jesus' rebuke here is really very harsh. Because if you notice, the word rebuke features in the text, but it's not the disciples that get rebuked, it's the storm. I think he's a bit concerned maybe that they don't have more faith than that, but they've never seen anybody calm a storm before. So I don't think we should judge them too harshly for the lack of faith. I don't think Jesus is judging them too harshly, but he is still clearly expecting them to have understood something, to have had a bit more faith. And it is kind of funny, isn't it, that the disciples seem to think that Jesus should be able to do something, but at the same time, they seem to be utterly convinced that they're going to drown. Well, we're not normally rational when we're in a state of panic, are we? So they could very easily have imagined both. But the really interesting thing is that when then Jesus wakes up, well, I mean, he had to really, and he does do something. I mean, he does what realistically is the only thing he could do in order to save them. He calms the storm. And they're still terrified. This time, of course, no longer by the prospect of drowning, but by the implications of what they have just seen. They know Jesus is special. They've worked that much out already, I think, from what they've seen and heard. They know Jesus is special. They just haven't quite grasped how special. And I think it's fair to say that they didn't really understand who Jesus was until after Easter and Pentecost, which is one reason why I don't like to kind of say, well, to make immediate direct comparisons between us here today and the disciples in the Gospels, because we know a lot more than they did at that time in the Gospels. And this very event, this calming of the storm, contributed and probably contributed quite strongly to their understanding of who Jesus was. Because if you think back to Psalm 107, there's only one who has this kind of power over nature, and that is the Creator God. So it isn't surprising really that when they see Jesus calming this fierce, vicious storm here with just a few words, and please note, Jesus just speaks in his own authority to the storm. He doesn't pray. He doesn't say, please, Father, calm this storm. He doesn't appeal to any kind of higher authority. He just does it himself. It's not surprising that when they see that they should then wonder who this really is. Well, as I said, we have more knowledge. We looked at the end of Matthew 28 fairly recently. We know that Jesus has this authority because he is indeed God. He doesn't need to call on God the Father to do something, because as God the Son, through whom everything was created, as you heard from the verses from Hebrews 1, he has authority in himself to do these things. He has authority. He is Jesus, the Son of God. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him, which is very reassuring when you consider putting your life in his hands, because after all, we're all in the same boat. Well, or are we? That's the big question here, isn't it? Again, I'm not a big fan of sermons that take a biblical story, very often an Old Testament story, and then turns it into a metaphor of everyday situations. You know, like you take David and Goliath, and then you turn Goliath into financial difficulties or temptations to sin or doubts to be overcome by slinging prayer or Bible verses at them. That's not what the story of David and Goliath is there for. And it's very common with this story of Jesus calming the storm as well. I remember learning a song in Sunday school. It was in Swedish. It may exist in English. I don't know. I don't think anybody sings it anymore. But it went basically, with Jesus in the boat, I can smile in the storm as I sail home. Does that exist in English as well? Yeah, I see some nodding heads. That's the thing. I know songs in Swedish, and then it turns out they've all been translated anyway. It's not fair. But anyway, you know what I mean. And that song was obviously not intended to reassure any budding sailors and fishermen in the Sunday school class that if they were out in a storm, Jesus would be with them. It's obviously a metaphor for life in general, sailing home to heaven in this case. But the thing is, this story in Mark chapter 4 is not a metaphor. It's not a parable. It's something that actually happened, and it happened in a way you could say so that Jesus could demonstrate his power and his authority in a new way. It's there to show us more of who Jesus is. It's not a parable of life. But then still, maybe because of what it is, maybe it's still worth putting ourselves in their soaking sandals, as it were. They're out there on the lake. This sudden storm comes up. They are terrified. And Jesus, whose fault it is that they're out there in the first place, he is asleep. I love the fact that Mark adds this detail. He was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. I mean, that is an eyewitness detail if ever I saw one. And I may have mentioned before that we don't know for certain, but church historical tradition says that Mark wrote his gospel mainly based on Peter's recollection. So it's sort of Peter's memoirs, if you like. Peter told the story. Peter was there, and he probably remembered the cushion. It might have been his boat. Maybe it was his cushion. We don't know. But there he is, sleeping on a cushion. And they are terrified. And the thing is, sometimes it may well seem like that for us as well. It may well seem like Jesus is asleep while we are struggling. We're left to our own devices. And we ask the same obvious question. Jesus, don't you care? I've already given one book recommendation. This book I actually remembered to bring in. This is another book. I've recently reread it. I've read it a few times in my life. It's called Bruczko. There, you have to read it that way to see it. This is the book that inspired me to want to be a missionary when I read it as a teenager. It's a great story of faith. God is very much at work, but it's also a story of struggle and suffering. The main character is an American teenager called Bruce, or Bruczko. It's the same person. And he gets this call to become a missionary in the jungles of South America. And he goes off on his own in 1961. And at one point, it's a fascinating story. And at one point in the story, he is alone in the jungle. He's injured. He's struggling to get back to civilization. And he's very, very hungry because he hasn't eaten for 5 days. He's lost. So you may wonder, where is God in all that? And then, just as he's basically not able to keep moving, he's sitting down by the stone by a river. And this, I forgot to bring him up there. So yeah, that's what he looks like now. That's what he looked like back then. So he's stuck in the jungle, not able to move on. And then suddenly, this stalk of ripe bananas comes floating down the river. Not that particular stalk, but that's what they look like. So he sees this yellow blur, manages to focus. It's these bananas floating on the river. He manages to get them, and they're ripe. So he eats them, gains new strength, manages to get up and get going, and find some people who can help him, bring him to civilization. Eventually, he returns to the jungle, and he sees this entire Indian tribe, who he was aiming to reach in the first place, learn to trust Jesus, become followers of Jesus. It's a wonderful story. And God obviously had a great plan for him. God wanted him there in the jungle with these Indians. He sent these bananas to keep him alive. And Bruce writes in the book that he was reminded of the 23rd Psalm, God preparing a table of bananas for him. But when I read it, my thought was, why did God leave it till then? Why did he let him struggle for 5 days without food, injured, jaundiced, I think, as well, through the jungle? And then when he's kind of on the verge of dying, then he sends the bananas and kind of eventually gets him out of there. And the thing is, I have no idea. I can't give a rational, well, hopefully I will give a sort of reasoned, rational answer to it, but I can't answer, and Bruce never had an answer for why it happened that way. All I know is that it seems like God often gives the minimum of support, just as much as we need to keep going. And C.S. Lewis makes the same observation, and he compares it with a parent helping a child learn to walk. Because at first, obviously, when you're helping this child to walk, you have to hold their hands the whole time, otherwise they're just going to fall on the bum. But then you have to let them go. You have to kind of put them there and say, okay, walk. And there is no parent to catch them if they fall. I mean, to begin with, maybe just a meter, 6 feet, 2 meters, whatever. But eventually, they learn to walk, but they will have a fair few falls on the way. And in the same way, it seems that God might give more support when we're young or immature in our faith, to remind us that, yes, I am here. Yes, I do love you. Yes, you have made the right decision. And then as we grow in our faith and commitment, he allows greater trials with no noticeable involvement. I say noticeable because there will still be involvement. We might just not be aware of it. But if you think that Bruchko, this American teenager in the jungle, or C.S. Lewis, if you think they're not quite enough of an authority to kind of take this as a sort of explanation, here is Jesus' half-brother James. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Now that seems outrageous, doesn't it? Consider your trials joy. I don't like it any more than you do. I don't find it any easier than any of you do. But this is Jesus' half-brother James writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. We have to take it seriously. And his point is that when your faith is tested, you will grow. You will become more mature, more complete as a follower of Jesus, better equipped to serve the Lord, better equipped to support others when they are tested, better equipped to resist temptation, to grow in holiness. In short, more like Jesus. Yes, Jesus is with us in the boat, whether it's a literal or metaphorical one, but he doesn't always act immediately. Yes, Jesus does care. Don't get me wrong, of course Jesus cares. But it seems that often he's primarily concerned about us becoming strong, godly disciples and children of God. And he will often use these trials and difficulties to achieve that, because they give us an opportunity to trust. God isn't unconcerned about suffering. Sometimes you get this sort of sermon, and it makes it sound like God doesn't care if people are suffering or not. That's not what I'm saying. God does care about suffering, and he is working to get rid of suffering. But the thing is, in this world, suffering and death are just symptoms of a greater evil. They are symptoms of humanity's rebellion against God. And that's what Jesus currently is dealing with. But he is working towards this new world, this new creation. And when he ushers in that new creation, obviously there will be no suffering. There will be no death. There'll be plenty of bananas at any time. Well, I hope so. In a way, I like bananas. But until we get there, in the here and now, it seems that he's often more concerned to make us more like Jesus than to alleviate suffering. And he often allows things, whether it's circumstances or diseases or whatever, he often allows things to play out according to natural causes so that we have a chance to react in faith. Do you remember Paul, the apostle? Have I mentioned him before? Remember Paul en route to Rome? He was also caught in the middle of a storm in the book of Acts. And again, Jesus appears to him and comforts him, but he didn't still the storm. And in fact, there doesn't really seem to be any obvious supernatural intervention at all in this journey, Paul's journey to Rome. And here's another example. Anybody can guess what that is? It's a bit dark, but it's a man in the dark, and there's a hole in the roof there. It's the prophet Jeremiah from the Old Testament. The prophet Jeremiah was speaking faithfully in behalf of God. He got put in prison. He was thrown down into an empty cistern, which is what that is. He was rejected by his family purely for speaking God's words. And I'm including him as well because some people think that these difficulties and sufferings and setbacks are God's punishment. Or if not punishment, at least corrections. You are going the wrong way, so you have to encounter these difficulties to realize that you're going the wrong way and have to turn around. The Bible and church experience is full of examples of the exact opposite. Often, the people who most definitely are doing what God wanted them to do are the ones who encounter these storms and these sufferings. We have Paul on his way to Rome. We have Jeremiah preaching the word of God. We have Bruce Olson in the jungle. We even have the disciples in the boat in this original story that we read. They were all where God wanted them to be. They were doing or trying to do what God wanted them to do. Their difficulties and sufferings were definitely not the result of disobedience and doubt. So yes, faithful followers will face storms. We may even have to face death. And I say may, eventually we will face death unless Jesus comes back fairly soon. So we will have these difficulties. There will be suffering. Let's not assume, though, that it means that Jesus doesn't care, because we should know better than that by now. That was a question that the disciples asked in Mark chapter 4 during Jesus' earthly ministry. They didn't know better. Our response should maybe be more like that of Paul and Silas when they'd been thrown into jail in Philippi. They're praising God. They're in prison. And they're praising God because they know that Jesus is with them, and they know that their faith is ultimately in his hands. Now, I did want to point out that there is another difference between the story in Mark and here and now. Jesus was asleep. He was genuinely exhausted from his ministry because he was living an ordinary human life in many ways. He had to eat and drink and go to the toilet and sleep just like the rest of us. He was exhausted from his ministry, and he knows what life on earth is like. But of course, now he's not asleep. He's returned to his throne in heaven. He's always awake and alert and involved. So remember that. He could sleep in the boat. He does no longer need a cushion. And we don't know what we will face on this journey through life, boats or no boats. And of course, the COVID pandemic has reminded us that we are mortal. We are not in control. But the Bible reminds us that if we are connected to Jesus, if we're committed to him in faith, that doesn't matter. Our mortality isn't a problem, because the Jesus who defeated the storm also defeated death. Keep coming back to that. And he is with us. He is Emmanuel, God with us. We may have to go through difficult times. Things may be looking bad, but Jesus is with us. He isn't asleep. And if we hold on to him, come what may, in the end, we know that everything will be okay. Everything will be eternally okay.